Hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Cohen, the Executive Director of Conciliation Resources here in London. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our second See the Human event, and I'm delighted to welcome Betty Bigombe and Janine Giovanni to be with us this evening. We've got a global audience today, people joining us from more than 30 countries around the world, so that's really exciting. And before we start our conversation, I'd like to just mention a couple of housekeeping points. We expect the event today to run for 1 hour, and we'll save a little bit of time towards the end for some questions from those of you in the audience. And please do click on the button where it says Ask a Question at the bottom of your screen in order to post questions. And please do stick to just using this for questions, not for discussion. And the event is being recorded so that we can share it with others who may have wanted to attend but couldn't. This is part of a series organized by Conciliation Resources, and we're an international organization committed to stopping violent conflict and creating more peaceful societies. We've been doing this for almost 30 years now, and we've been working directly with people impacted by war and violence and working to bridge divides and to influence the way peace is made. This is something I think that seems more urgent than ever today. While so much of our attention in the past fortnight has been focused on the shocking events in Ukraine, we shouldn't forget that these will have a significant impact across the world, impacting food supplies, energy prices, and more than anything, security in many other countries. And many of those countries, whether it's Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Syria, Yemen, have already experienced years of destructive and devastating conflict. At our first event 6 weeks ago, the final question that was posed was about Ukraine and what to do about the risk of further escalation there. Sadly, the escalation into violent and brutal war has shown the limitations of diplomacy. Nevertheless, I think it's really important that we invest hope and intellect in the potential for diplomacy to bring the violence to an end and to prevent even more lives being lost and even more people being displaced. I think it's quite extraordinary that we've seen more than 2.5 million people displaced from Ukraine already, and this adds to a global number of more than 70 million people displaced, which coming from someone living in the United Kingdom, that's more people than live in the United Kingdom are displaced around the world. And I think that's quite a sobering statistic for us to think about. But we know that from experience that in the middle of every conflict, there are ordinary people not just suffering terrible impacts, but also demonstrating extraordinary courage and resilience. And I think more than anything today, we need some inspiration from other experiences of how mediation and peace building can work to prevent and resolve violent conflicts. To hear about how in the midst of violence, there are people who find creative ways to build peace. In this light, it's a real privilege to be joined by Betty and Janine to explore some of their experience and for them to tell us some of what they've seen. Betty is a mediator originally from Uganda who's promoted peace and reconciliation in war zones for some 30 years, starting in northern Uganda where she reached out to the Lord's Resistance Army. More recently, she supported talks in Colombia and in particular been part of a team mediating in South Sudan. Previously, Betty's been a senior director at the World Bank, and she's also a member of the Women Mediators across the Commonwealth network, which is a network that Conciliation Resources has been very proud to support. And she's joining us today from Turkey. So you're very welcome, Betty. And Janine, who's joining us from Yale, is an award-winning author, journalist, and war correspondent who's presently the senior fellow and professor at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Janine started her work in war-torn societies 3 decades ago, reporting on the first intifada, in the first Palestinian intifada, and then writing about the siege in Sarajevo. And since then, she's covered the genocide in Rwanda, wars in Sierra Leone, Somalia, Chechnya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, to name but some. Her most recent book is The Vanishing, which explores the twilight of Christianity in the Middle East. And I was actually having lunch with a colleague today who's saying, oh, I'm so excited to hear Janine because her book, Ghosts by Daylight, was just such a powerful book. So a vote of confidence from one of my colleagues, Janine, and it's a pleasure to have you with us as well. But let's get started with our conversation and explore what it means to see the human in conflict situations. And I'd like to start with you, Betty, if I may. Perhaps you could tell us about a key experience that you've had that shaped how you think about seeing the human in the midst of violent conflict.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all participants. Thank you very much for having me in this session. When I think of the experiences, the one that I remember most, there's so many that it's very difficult to pick and choose. But I want to start by saying that as a mediator, or if you set out to resolve conflict, you have your own agenda. And usually you are in a hurry to make things happen because you want to succeed. And my experience was that I had to totally put away my agenda and not just try to understand the conflict better, but also listen to the people, because I went in talking to them, telling them that war was bad, it was dangerous, they would die, it was senseless, they must stop. And that was the language that I used all the time. But it did not take me too long to realize that all those words I was saying were falling onto deaf ears. What I needed was to listen to them, what the issues they had. It's not if somebody picks up a weapon to go and fight, there must be something that drives that person to go to that limit, because you know very well it's not a football match. There's a possibility of getting maimed, possibility of even getting killed. So I changed my strategy completely and became a listener to try to find out, and I must always say this, because one of the things I've been advocating for today, in the recent past, is getting psychosocial help for those who are affected by war, and not just the grassroots who bear the burden of conflicts, but also the negotiators, because when they come to the table, they're very scarred, they're very traumatized, because they've come face to face with death. They've lost properties, they've lost their dear ones. So listening in itself is a virtue. It helps. So I changed my strategy, and it was not to lecture, and it was not to sit and invite people in town halls. What changed everything was reaching out to people and staying in internally displaced camps. That I did not eat anything more different than what the people in internally displaced camps were eating. I did not, there was nothing different. And identifying with that suffering, that when children were dropping dead every day and you identified with them in mourning, and that helped in building trust. When the sick came for help and I had some medication, it was about sharing with them, and that helped in building trust. So my strategy was then just listen and not lecture to people like I had started doing, but also identifying with the sufferings of the people. And that is how slowly I won the hearts, because we must know it's not the sons and daughters of the elite that fight wars. It is the grassroots, and these grassroots are in camps. They're the mothers, they're the fathers, they're the uncles, they're the wives, they're the sisters of the. And it hit me that this is not only in northern Uganda, I was also in northern Nigeria, that it was reaching out to these very people who are internally displaced, who are living in squalid camps, are the people who have the information, are the people who can connect you with the fighters, because it is their sons and not the elite whose children go to Europe for education, who have access to medical treatment. But this, if I may say, the downtrodden, the unprivileged, that opened the avenue of talking, because I built that kind of trust. I showed to them that I was not above them, I was one of them. And therefore, information started flowing in. And that eventually led me to reach out to the rebel leaders, because I believe they were sending information to him too, of what was going on, in trying to end the war. Because you talk about inclusivity, I thought that was the most important people to reach out, because I'd been wasting a lot of time talking to the elite, talking to the men, not involving women. But once women got involved, I remember vividly one thing that changed. At first, it had a negative impact, and that I wrote and signed letters and gave to mothers, wives, sisters to reach out to their sons or relatives. That encouraged a lot of defection, because then they realized they could be rehabilitated. And of course, the backlash was that the rebels then went wild and started killing people. So I changed strategies from time to time, to be able to reach out to the rebels and persuade them to agree to a negotiated settlement. It wasn't just persuading the rebels, it was about persuading the president of Uganda, because he said, these are bandits. They have no political ideology. What are you going to talk to them? We'll kill them. And that was the word: bandits, killing. And that was it. But it was also persuading him. It was persuading Parliament that believed they needed jungle law to help with people, with these monsters who were killing people in the most terrible manners, and who were abducting children, turning girls into sex slaves. So it took persuasion, and this is what I usually preach. It's what you do before you go to the round table that really matters, which creates the foundation for conflict resolution or eventually mediation. I think I'll stop there for the time being.
No, thanks so much for that, Betty. And I think you've really given a sense of how you reached out to members of the Lord's Resistance Army and the community from which they came to help them think differently about conflict. And I think it's a nice lead into Janine's experience, because Betty, you were talking about the importance of listening and trust, which I think very much resonate from the writing that you've done, Janine, that you've been able to step into communities, not just as a war reporter trying to catch the latest information, but to really understand the communities and the experience that they've had. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you've enabled yourself to connect with people in order to tell the story of the violence that they've experienced.
Of course. First of all, thank you very much for having me, Jonathan. Thank you, Betty, for the work that you do. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. This is the first time in my adult life that I am not on the ground during a major conflict. Basically, for the past 35 years, I've reported every violent conflict in Africa, in the Balkans, and in the Middle East. So it seems very strange to not be right now in Kiev, but I will be. I just have to let classes finish at Yale. So as Betty was talking, I mean, the basis of my work is to embed with communities. That's what I do. The few times that I've had to actually embed with traditional armies and not rebel armies in Chechnya or in Sierra Leone or in Liberia, I feel very uncomfortable working with the US Army or the British Army. What I really try to get the essence of is how people live during wartime, how they survive, what happens to their society, how do the hospitals operate when they're being bombed by Russian planes, how did people survive throughout the 3.5-year siege of Sarajevo, how do societies reconstruct after genocides such as Srebrenica, Rwanda, or even the Yazidi massacres, the ISIS war crimes that began in 2014. So my job is very much almost as an anthropologist rather than a journalist. I never think of myself as a reporter that could say to people, how do you feel? I tend to go, I spend a very long time, and it is essential to get people's trust. One thing I think I would say, actually two things that I've gleaned from many years of doing this kind of work, this sort of deep dives into conflict, is that the resilience of some groups of people is extraordinary. And I always think back of the people of Sarajevo, especially now while I'm watching the Ukrainians' resistance. The Sarajevans refused to break. They refused, despite being shelled every day, hundreds of shells, not having water, not having electricity, not having medical care, not having humanitarian aid, not having arms, because there was an arms embargo. And yet they managed to maintain not only their dignity, but a sense that they were going to get through this conflict. And it was really something that set me for the rest of my life and the rest of my professional life as a template. The other thing is I worked so much with refugees. That's the other big part of my work, going all the way back, of course, the Palestinian refugees, but more Bosnia and in Africa, and of course, the Syrian crisis. I spent a lot of time on the ground in refugee camps. I always find that the thing that people have to understand, and they never really do, is that no one ever wants to leave their home unless they are forced to. No one ever wants to take their documents in one hand and put a backpack on and carry their children and leave their country, their roots. And it is the most devastating thing. So the reaction, I was in America. I haven't lived in America since I was a teenager. So I came back during the Trump years, which was very disturbing. And it was the backlash against, it was the Muslim ban. And this set up for me, at the time I was writing a book about the war in Syria, this terrible differentiation between good refugees who were Christians who were allowed to come into the US and bad refugees who were from Afghanistan or Africa or Iraq or Syria, and they were not allowed to come. And I found myself stressing over and over whenever I would do public appearances or lecturing that the plight of a refugee, no matter what their creed, their race, their color, is one of desperation. People do not want to leave their homes. So I think if all of us, whether or not we're in conflict resolution or we're writers or we're professors, need to develop deep empathy and compassion for people, especially during times of immense crisis catastrophe. Of course, we're talking today with the backdrop of the Ukraine, but there are many other, Ethiopia. The war in Syria is still ongoing. There are conflicts all over the world. And I think that people tend, especially the general public, the media is extremely fickle. Right now, CNN is in Ukraine. So the world will focus on that. It's the front page of the New York Times. But in a month, they'll go. And that's when the real work needs to be done. The documentation of war crimes, the work that people like Betty do, the work that you do, Jonathan. It's really the most important time in war is when the television cameras and the journalists leave. And then the real story of what happened emerges. And it's essential that we let people tell their own stories by giving them agency to do that. I'll stop it now because I know you want to have a conversation, but
no, I mean it's extraordinary to hear.
If it's okay with you, Jonathan,
Please
I just
go ahead,
thought I
Betty.
would jump in.
Please do.
What Janine is saying is very important. Oftentimes we don't think about it in depth. It resonates very well with me about nobody wanting to leave their homes. Forceful leaving of homes is dehumanizing. It takes away all kinds of dignity. It doesn't matter what a humble background you come from, that you can sleep in your own house, defend for yourself, and suddenly you're driven out and you leave whatever you have behind. Like what I am seeing in for food, people who lived that they would line up for milk, for water. Suddenly they're deprived people. And the trauma that comes with it. And in some cases, they're leaving dead bodies behind in them because they run away with basic minimums. In some cases, I've seen this where children are left behind, they're lost. They've maybe escaped with some other people, and the anxiety of not knowing where they are. And that is where I bring in it's not just humanitarian assistance, some kind of psychosocial is important along the line of giving humanitarian assistance. I've dealt with people who are totally despondent, hopeless. Whatever you give them. I was in Rwanda, actually, the very first people after this genocide that went in, and I saw the hopelessness, where mothers were staring into space because they participated in killing of members of their families. So it's something the pains that people who are forced out of their homes to escaping to save their lives and without any properties, and then total dependence out of the blues. It's something that is very traumatizing. And this is, I don't know what's happening now. You'll find that the rate of mental breakdown, alcohol, suicide, they all set in such environment. So it's giving out blankets and food. It's got to be more than that. I just thought I would supplement what
Thank you, Betty.
Janine
I think
was saying.
that's really important. And I think it emphasizes the psychosocial trauma that people experience as a result of conflict. I think one of the challenges is that, as you've both very eloquently described, conflict it's beyond horrendous. And people go through experiences that it's hard to imagine. We watch on television, but it's hard to really imagine how that affects you. And yet there are still people in these situations who are thinking, how do we bring this conflict to an end? How do we look for opportunities to find a political solution to the conflict? How do we try and think what compromise could look like so that we can get back to a way of living that isn't conditioned by violence? And I think one of the challenges is that in the midst of this violence, how do we support people who are actually looking for that path? How do we support those who are looking for ways out of the violence? And I wonder if you could share some thoughts on what you've seen of the people who do choose to take that path. Janine, do you want to come in there, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to go back to the trauma of war and what it does, because I mainly work with victims of torture or victims of sexual violence during wartime, and I try to document their stories. And it takes a great deal of time and trust. It's not something you could just jump in and say, "Tell me your story." You need to spend a lot of time with people and have deep compassion, empathy, and listen to them. But I think that what Betty said, it's so important that we recognize trauma in society, not just the primary level of it, but secondary and also re-traumatizing. For instance, Bosnia, and this is linked to justice. The genocide at Srebrenica and the many other war crimes that were committed, including systematic rape, where many of the women were held in rape camps and raped up to 16 times a day for purely purposes of impregnating them, Bosnian Muslim women, to break their gene pool. Similar in Rwanda, and again with the Yazidi community and some of the Christian community in Iraq and Syria during the time of the Islamic State. So how do you in the aftermath of this, how do you put a society back together? How do you try to heal these extraordinarily deep and complicated wounds and lead in some way to reconciliation? Well, for me, part of it is justice. And not having justice, which, for instance, in Bosnia, I could count on two hands the number of those rapists that were actually brought to The Hague. It was not for lack of trying. There were some excellent people working on it. It's just that justice was delayed. Syria was a very different situation because it was more than 20 years later. Everyone had a cell phone, which meant that they had cameras. So when barrel bombs came down in Aleppo from helicopters flying at low range, which barrel bombs, of course, are handmade devices that are meant to inflict the worst possible damage only on civilian areas. So they're meant to cause mayhem, destruction, death, to maim people. Or when Russian bombers bombed the hospitals in Aleppo or throughout Syria, as they are now doing in Ukraine, people recorded it. It was recorded on their iPhones. And much of that evidence now is going through a mechanism called the IIIM, which is at the UN in Geneva. And these are extraordinary people who are going through the forensics and the data and the evidence to say, yes, you did this. Now, why are war crimes so important to document? Because they lead to accountability, so that people like Bashar al-Assad does not sit in Damascus thinking he is absolutely scot-free from the hideous crimes he's committed. It means that there are people who are saying, we're coming to get you. And the same thing will happen with Putin, and has happened in other countries. In places where justice has not been delivered, such as Bosnia, there will never be a sense of healing. And as I say this, Bosnia is bubbling up again. Republika Srpska giving indications they want to secede. President Putin again stirring up trouble there. So I just truly believe unless you have some kind of healing, some kind of truth and reconciliation, which happened to some extent in South Africa and in Rwanda with the Gacaca courts, which are courts which were basically set up because the traditional judicial system, the International Criminal Court or special tribunals, would have taken half a century to go through the million people that were killed during the genocide in Rwanda. So Gacaca courts are local courts that were set up with local, let's say, the tribesmen and people, bringing the victims and the perpetrators together and tried to have local justice. There were problems with it, largely corruption, but they are a really good example of how justice can be delivered when you have these hideous crimes that otherwise would take too long to go through the traditional system.
Thanks, Janine. And Betty, I know that you've looked at this issue in northern Uganda around justice and how communities deal with the violent experience that they've had. And I suppose this question of bringing perpetrators to account is one element of trying to prevent a recurrence. Another element is this question of healing the trauma and helping people tell their stories and helping people be heard. What's your experience of that, Betty, from working with communities in northern Uganda and the need to give people space to try and understand what reconciliation can mean in their daily lives?
Thank you, Jonathan. Maybe before I answer your question, let me talk about one huge mistake I made dealing with the community. And that was the anxiety. I was desperate to make rebels who returned or who defected or were persuaded to come out of the bush and stop fighting, to make sure that they were resettled. That was basically to send a message to those others who were still fighting to come out, and that they would be safe. One, two, they would be resettled, and there was not going to be they would not be prosecuted. And in the process, I totally ignored victims of the rebels. And I still remember vividly one woman in a camp asking me, "Is it because my son did not kill, and that is why you cannot get tuition for him to go to school?" Because we see the killers being rewarded, because obviously we were giving them some simple household items, we were giving them some little cash, and they say they pass right next to us, and we're destitute. Here they are being rewarded for what they did to us, and that made reconciliation very, very difficult. And it's very easy when you're desperate to make this kind of mistake and punish victims twice because you're desperate to get the war to end by, you know, by trying to lure those who are still out there to give up fighting. I thought that was important to mention because
No, thank
oftentimes we
you.
fall into that trap.
Yeah. Thank you for that,
And
Betty. And we've
I
actually got a
relate.
question. I'll just ask a question from the audience, Betty, and I think it'll then lead into what you wanted to say. Because one of our questions is, how do we support communities to heal? And how do we address the issues of justice? Because I think there's a challenge that justice in the form of international courts, which is hugely important, is also hugely expensive. And it can, as Janine, you said, it can take many years. So on the one hand, we need that, but on the other hand, communities need some sense of healing and justice so that they can live. And I just wonder how we balance that equation.
Can I say something, Jonathan? Because I'd like to give an example of the Yazidi community. After the ISIS, after so many of the women were taken as sex slaves to Raqqa, but when ISIS finally fell and they came back to their homes in northern Iraq and Kurdistan, there was something that I've never seen before in my decades of working in countries where there had been systematic rape or grievous sexual violence during wartime. These women were accepted back into their communities, which was extraordinary. Their highest faith-based leader actually gave a statement saying, "We will not shun these women. We will not exclude them. We will take them back." Now, when I worked in Kosovo or Bosnia or Syria, indeed, women who had been raped or had been violated had a very difficult time coming back into their communities. Some women couldn't even tell their husbands. Other women I know told me that they were engaged and their marriages were broken off because they had been raped. So I always look at this as a reference point of something extraordinary. And there were local groups, one in particular called Yazda, which did amazing work by, again, rehabilitation, but also really, really grassroots, like very much on the ground, working with how could we get these women back into their communities and feeling safe and feeling working on their trauma, absolutely, which is a big endeavor, but to bring them back to the heart of the community. It's extremely important.
So, no, thank you, Janine. So, Janine, you're talking about the need to bring people back into the community. And Betty, you're talking about the effort to try and break the cycle of violence by trying to reintegrate people who were part of perpetrating the violence. I think you were going to tell us a bit more, Betty, about the experience of what you went through in northern Uganda. So could you maybe say a bit more about that?
I must say right at the onset that it wasn't really easy. I talked about the mistake I made because I was so anxious to end the war, and by coming out with some measures that actually hurt the victims. Like I said, they were being punished twice. One thing is, which I think Janine alluded to, the victims usually feel justice must be done. Otherwise, we can talk about reconciliation in a very superficial manner. Even with trauma, well, in the case of northern Uganda, the complexity of the matter was that these were children who were abducted. They were robbed of their childhood, robbed of their innocence, and turned into killing machines and became perpetrators. Today we have Dominic Ongwen in The Hague, who has, I don't think he's been convicted yet, but nevertheless, the sentence is there. And the community were very divided about it because he was abducted. But the argument was we had so many others who were abducted, who killed, but got any opportunity to come out of the bush as early as possible. Onwen had the opportunity to do that. In fact, in one of the negotiation sessions that I met him in the bush, he was the one who was threatening me all the time. We could not even have eye contact. All he was saying was, well, if we find women in the wrong place at the wrong time, we feel, we just kill with no sense of remorse whatsoever. So basically the community were divided in the sense that, well, he was also abducted, but there were also these others who were abducted who got opportunity to escape, and they did escape. Now, going back into reconciling the fractured community is something you have
Oh, I think we've lost you, Betty. Are you back, Betty?
You lost me?
I think you're coming back, but let's hold on a sec, Betty, and maybe we'll come back to you. Hopefully the connection will come back in a moment. Janine, whilst we're waiting for Betty to come back, one of the things that... Are you back with us, Betty? Betty, if you can hear, I'll just ask Janine a question and we'll come back to you in a moment. One of the things I've been very struck by, Janine, is there are some conflicts where it feels very much like a kind of black and white situation. But there are many where there are a lot of shades of grey, where atrocities are perpetrated by both sides, the many sides. It's often not just two sides. There are situations where the disputed interpretation of the past actually fuels the conflict and sustains the conflict, and the inability for people to reach a common understanding of why their communities have arrived at where they are fuels the violence between them. And one of the things that we've observed in work we've done in Central African Republic, Kashmir, the Caucasus, is that it can be really difficult to create the spaces for relationships to develop where difficult conversations can happen that enable people to move forward. And reconciliation in many ways is about relationships and giving people the opportunity to connect and understand without always actually trying to put them on the spot and punish them. I mean, as you say, punishment and avoiding impunity is critical, but then there's also the human side of connecting and engaging. How have you seen that dilemma addressed?
Well, I think it's so fascinating if you are working in a conflict and you have the opportunity to talk to both sides, and to really go deep into both sides, not just dipping in one or the other. The narrative that you will get are extraordinary. I mean, even if we want to take it right now to the Russian narrative versus the Ukrainian narrative, the Russians have their own history and their own. Well, of course, we've got Putin, but this is where disinformation and misinformation comes in as well, which is something that is much more prevalent I'd say in the past decade, since the war in Syria. It was the first time really that I realized that I had to be very cautious of propaganda, of false information. And that, of course, is because of social media. Social media, people getting their news from Twitter, Facebook, TikTok now. People are following the war in Ukraine on TikTok. Um, has really kind of given us very slanted views of conflict. So, I mean, I think the times I felt that I had, and I've worked in places for years, like let's say Syria, I basically spent 7-8 years working there. The Balkans, I spent more than a decade. And sometimes I would feel like the more I knew it, the more confused I would get. So I think the best thing you could do, and it's very simple, is to listen to as many narratives as you can, and try to understand the politics of memory, which always plays into narratives, especially in places like the Balkans, where everything goes back to World War One, World War Two, and you need a vast understanding of what happened in the past in order to understand the current conflicts and also how they will heal. So I think if you wanted to sum it up, Jonathan, the best way again would be to do what you do, which is to listen to people, to try to put them in a room and sit them at a table. And I'm not talking about UN negotiators or track one, because I'm very cynical about that. What I mean is the faith-based leaders, the commanders' wives, who actually have a huge influence, are never recognized, and to listen to what they have to say. What is it that they want? And the other thing, the first question I ever ask people once we have our cups of tea and ask about families is, what happened to you? That's all I say is, what happened to you? And that opens up the ground for them to talk about the conflict or what happened to their countries or their regions. And it also leaves room for the other side to come in and give their side, their narrative. I think Betty's back with us.
I think she is, but thank you, Janine. That was really fascinating. And Betty, I hope you were able to hear much of that. And I'd love to come back
Just a
to
little
what you were
bit of
saying.
it.
Yeah. Do you want to come back
Just a
in
little,
with what you were?
just right. Maybe we could move on, but what I wanted to say about reconciliation is a process. It's not something that can be forced. It's just like I talked earlier about psychosocial support, the ability to get somebody to come to terms. As one rebel was telling me, ex-combatants of the Lord's Resistance Army was telling me, was that you have to come to terms with what you have done to other people. You also have to come to terms with what has been done to you. So it's not something that happens overnight. It is, we say time heals, but not with the heinous crimes that are deliberately committed against innocent people. That is, justice must be done. Somebody must be accountable. And it's only that way that the victims feel justice has been done and they can come to terms and they can pick up the pieces of their lives. The other component, which has been talked about, but not really usually implemented, is reparation. I think reparation is an effective tool, but who do you leave out and who do you? I wouldn't call it compensate. Who do you give something to? This is, in the case of Uganda, northern Uganda, became extremely complex. I know the International Criminal Court tried to do it, but even then, it was a hush-hush thing done to some people and others left out. So it's just where the resources come from. But if it was possible to do it in an organized, systematic manner, it is another way of recognition of what the wrong thing that was done to some innocent individuals. But let me give you a simple example. At one time, I was dealing with a young man who was extremely suicidal. And because he was abducted with his brother, and they walked maybe 30 kilometers, and his brother, who was a couple of years older than him, suddenly asked the commander of the LRA and said, "Could I rest?" And the commander says, "We can leave you here to rest." Gives his brother an axe to kill him. And this brother, the first time he tried his own brother, but did not. And the commander roared in anger and said, "Okay, we're going to kill you." And then somebody would kill your brother. And then he begged to be given another chance. And he said he had that last eye contact with his brother. It was like, "You can't do it." And he marshaled up his energy and managed to kill his brother. Now, the commander was already out. And did he want to see that commander? Yes. Yes. And I brought this commander to him. And he was very remorseful. And that helped a little bit. But even then, it took time to come to terms with what he had done and to accept that this commander who ordered him to his own brother was also under pressure from their leader. So it takes, just like Janine was talking about, talking to the community, talking to those who witnessed, talking to those who saw it happen, telling the story and getting, and sometimes what I say, what I advocate for is ability to just listen, because some of these people will repeat the same thing over and over again, and that is how they can get over the trauma sometimes of what has been done to them.
Thanks, Betty. I mean, it's a traumatic story, and it's not easy to hear these sorts of experience and to recognize that somehow efforts have to be made to help people overcome them. One of the challenges is, and we've got a question that I think really poses this very well: what can we do to achieve justice when the perpetrators and the victims are both victims, in a sense? And I think what you're saying, Betty, is that there's a real need for a very significant investment in psychosocial support to help people
Absolutely.
in some way come to terms with it. And I think what we're hearing is, on the one hand, we need that psychosocial support. We also need the judicial frameworks, the sense that there will be some kind of legal recourse that will hold perpetrators to account. Perhaps there's also a dilemma in that by seeking justice, and this is perhaps what happened with the Lord's Resistance Army at the Juba talks, by seeking justice, you potentially trigger further conflict because the perpetrators aren't prepared to be brought to justice. And then you have the question, can local, or does it have to be international justice, or can the national or local justice system be effective in holding people to account? And that, I think, if I understand correctly, was one of the critical challenges in Uganda at that point.
There's also universal jurisdiction now, which is really important. I think that's a point that you have to make as well. Universal jurisdiction is being used in terms of the Syrian war because, of course, Assad doesn't subscribe to the ICC statutes, but crimes can be tried in countries such as France, the UK, Germany. We just had a landmark case in Koblenz, Germany. So war crimes can be tried from a distance if countries are prepared to use their national courts. But I mean, just going back to the point that you just made, I really do think that there has to be, for the victims of these crimes, some form of justice. And if there is not, then there's a kind of simmering that will result in conflict 20 or 30 years down the line. You just must have some kind of closure for people. If not economically, which rarely happens, then in some way a reckoning. I mean, look what's happening in America right now in terms of Black Lives Matter and the civil rights movement. I mean, America is sitting on a horrific, horrific deed of what was done to Black Americans. It is only now, I'd say in the past decade, that people are really looking at it. And the civil rights movement was in the early 1960s, but it's only now that we're looking at how Black men and women are treated differently in the policing system or in the prisons. And that to do that, you must do two things. You have to look back historically about how you work with the past. The Germans have done a very good job with that, incidentally. There's an entire long word in German, which I can't pronounce, which means working on the back of the past. And then the second thing is you have to get the voices of people to tell their story and their narrative. It's essential in any kind of healing.
Yeah. Could I just come
Thanks,
back?
Janine.
Oh, thank you.
Jonathan. Yeah.
Please do, Betty.
Thank you, Janine. Yeah. What goes into my mind immediately is, did Gachacha in Rwanda work? Because I'm yet to find, I've been trying to find out an evaluation report, but nothing really goes deep into it, whether it worked. Was it top driven? To some extent, yes. Were people doing it willingly? Yes. But also later, they found out, I mean, the people who they had to walk some distance, their competing needs with the family, and halfway through, they gave up and they couldn't continue anymore. Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Did it work? Yes, to some extent, yes, it did work. But the actual implementation, when it came to implementation, everybody got fatigue, everybody got tired, and there were no resources to compensate the victims. So, well, we can say time has healed, but there's still a lot of bitterness in South Africa today, especially because of especially the economically marginalized group that were marginalized back then, or their parents, and today they remain, the status quo remains. So these are things that we really need to understand. Going back to northern Uganda, there was a lot of romanticization about the traditional system of justice. Now, this traditional system of justice had never been tried on a large scale, had never really been documented, and the actual practice of it leaves out women. It's a man's thing, male domain. Two, the youth who participate in war were not part of that system. But civil society organizations, I would say, jumped on it and condemned ICC. But I must say, ICC worked as a catalyst to encourage LRA to come up to talk peace. And also, LRA, when the mediation was going on, ICC stepped back and decided not to interfere with the process because otherwise people saw it as a great opportunity, and the ordinary people that we want to see, but for heaven's sake, the timing is wrong. Let the mediation, let the peace process continue, and then we can get these guys, the perpetrators of violence, our killers, then we can get them later and bring them to book. There's no way we could leave them on our own. And I thought that made a lot of sense, but I did not trust the traditional justice system of justice, which a lot of people jumped on and said, oh, Mataput will do it. This is a Western concept. But I think it was promoted when people were desperate that the indictment by ICC would jeopardize the peace talks, and because when you ask every individual, they wanted these guys to face justice.
Yeah, thanks, Betty. That's really clear. One of the things that I think I'm drawing from what you're both saying is that a huge challenge is the underinvestment in processes of reconciliation and trauma healing.
Yes.
And one of the tragedies is that the in the same way that we don't invest enough in trying to prevent conflict, once the conflict's happened, we don't invest enough in dealing with the legacy of the conflict to help societies heal so that they don't revert back to a cycle of violence. But what we do invest way too much in is the catastrophic damage that war causes. And sadly, we're seeing that now, that in Ukraine, but we've seen it in many countries before, that efforts to invest in preventing the conflict before the violence escalates never seem to attract sufficient resources. Whereas once it does escalate, the money pours in. And I think this is a big challenge that all of us need to face. How do we make a stronger case for preventing conflict in advance? Janine, I can see you wanting to come in here.
Yeah. Well, what I'm immediately thinking of is small arms. There was a study done in the 1990s at the height of wars in Sierra Leone and Ivory Coast, and that came later, Somalia and Liberia, as well as the Balkans, that lighter weapons were easier for children to carry, that there was this rise in child soldiers. And a lot of this was because their weapons were much lighter. So, I mean, and I'm thinking to the war in Yemen, for instance, and the fact that Saudi is so involved in this terrible conflict. And yet the UK and France and the US continue to have arms deals with them. So for me, I think we really have to look at the arms trade. That's first and foremost, that we have to in some way, and Ukraine, like imagine the amount of arms that are going in and out now, and what, militias. All right, well, Russia has many private militias that they will use. The other thing, during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw the rise of these PMCs, of private militaries, and they were, of course, very active in Africa, Executive Outcome and Sandline and many others. But so I think if you're talking about like how we really get to the root of it, we have to look at weapons. I mean, that
So
is
I
one
think
of the primary, and the arms trade.
Yeah, no, thank you, Janine. And you're in sharing that thought, you're indeed answering a question that has come from the audience as well. I am conscious that we're reaching the end of our allotted hour. It's flown by, and the both of you have shared many insights and experiences. Betty, I don't know if you've got a final word you'd like to share before I bring this to a close.
Well, what you said a little while ago was like you were in the room in Antalya, where I was talking about we're not investing in prevention. When we talk about peacekeeping, hundreds and thousands of millions of dollars is being spent. Look at Congo, DR Congo. Peacekeepers have been there for how many years? And yet gender-based sexual violence still continues unabated. Well, it's not fair to say unabated. And they have no exit strategy whatsoever. But if you ask for resources for prevention, what you're grilled, what you put through. I was talking this today, telling my own story, that at one time I was almost ridiculed, and how are you going to manage it, and who are you going to talk to? And I said, well, when we talk about humanitarian assistance, I'm not saying that it's not necessary. Absolutely, yes. But we could avoid that by preventing conflict. So I just want us to literally preach, sing, that prevent. We could do more than what we're doing at the moment, spend more resources in prevention, because nobody wants this. It's very difficult to justify how you're going to do it, who you're going to talk to. If I go to an African leader before conflict breaks out and say, we're a sovereign state, we know what we're doing, this is just a bunch of bandits, which was the case with the Lord's Resistance Army, was the case with Boko Haram. But even then, we've not found avenues, we've not put our minds together to see how leaders can be not forced, but persuaded to agree to prevent violence before they break out into fully fledged wars. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty. I think that's a very powerful note on which to end. I'm very conscious that there are times when it is not easy to work on peace, and it brings a heavy burden. And I think the conversation today, on the one hand, has demonstrated the heavy burden that war generates, and that trying to bring peace in the wake of war isn't easy. But I think we've also seen that it can be inspiring, and that there are people who show courage and resilience and are prepared to take risks to build more peaceful societies, and to help people to understand what it means, and to actually help the victims of violence to rebuild their lives afterwards. It's been a real pleasure to have Janine and Betty with us, two people who in different ways have spent more than 3 decades trying to support people who've experienced violent conflict and to find some kind of solace after that conflict. So thank you enormously to both of you for having joined us. Thank you everyone who's listened in.
Us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the questions you posed. Thank you, Janine. And I do encourage you all to sign up to the mailing list so that you can hear about our next event. And there will be a recording of this available online in the next day or two. So it's been a pleasure to have this conversation, and goodbye, everybody.